Fix the truck no one can. And I'll pay double, the millionaire scoffed. What he didn't know was that the elderly man standing before him carried a past capable of ruining fortunes. That challenge would cost him far more than money. It would cost him everything. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the glass walls of Farias premium trucks, illuminating every polished surface of the facility that consumed an entire city block in one of Chicago's busiest commercial districts. Inside the pristine workspace, the hum of imported diagnostic equipment mixed with the distant rumble of traffic, creating a symphony of controlled efficiency that Leonard Farias had orchestrated over 15 years of relentless ambition. Leonard moved through his domain with the measured precision of a general inspecting troops. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the spotless epoxy floor as he surveyed the operation that bore his name. Every tool hung in its designated place. Every workstation maintained military-grade organization. Every employee focused on their tasks with the kind of intensity that came from knowing their boss tolerated nothing less than perfection. At 48, Leonard had built more than a business. He had constructed a fortress of reputation. In the heavy logistics industry, the Farias name commanded respect that bordered on reverence. International clients flew to Chicago specifically to witness his operation. Competitors studied his methods from afar, unable to replicate the culture of excellence he had forged through years of uncompromising standards and strategic ruthlessness. The crown jewel of his empire sat in the center bay, surrounded by the latest German diagnostic computers and precision tools that cost more than most people's homes. The Mercedes-Benz Actros, imported directly from Stuttgart, represented more than its $800,000 price tag. This single vehicle embodied Leonard's gateway into European markets, his proof to international partners that American precision could match anything the world had to offer. But the Actros hadn't started in 4 months. Leonard paused beside the massive truck, his reflection distorted in its polished chrome bumper. The irony wasn't lost on him. Surrounded by the most advanced diagnostic equipment money could buy, staffed by certified technicians with impeccable credentials, and yet this German masterpiece remained as silent as a monument to his own limitations. Outside the glass walls, the city of Chicago moved at its relentless pace. Pedestrians hurried past without glancing inside. Unaware that behind the impressive facade, Leonard Farias was facing the first real threat to his carefully constructed world. The European contract deadline loomed like a storm cloud, carrying with it not just financial consequences, but something far more valuable and fragile: his reputation. He had built his success on the simple principle that authority demanded distance. Employees respected him because they feared disappointing him. Clients trusted him because he never showed weakness. Competitors avoided direct confrontation because Leonard Farias didn't lose. But standing beside $800,000 of silent German engineering, Leonard felt something creeping into his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Not anger at his staff's incompetence, not frustration with the machine's complexity, but something far more unsettling: doubt in his own invincibility. The morning shift was beginning, and soon he would need to face his team with answers he didn't have, solutions that continued to elude him, and confidence he was struggling to maintain. Leonard's footsteps echoed through the workshop as the morning shift assembled for their daily briefing. 23 employees stood in precise formation near the main diagnostic bay, their uniforms crisp and identical, faces set in the carefully neutral expressions that had become standard protocol when their boss addressed the team. The overhead fluorescent lights cast everything in stark clarity, leaving no shadows to hide behind. "Gentlemen," Leonard began, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect across 3 states. "We have 46 hours remaining until the European inspection. I want status reports, not excuses." Marcus Rivera, his lead technician and a man with 15 years of German automotive certification, stepped forward first. His hands, usually steady enough to calibrate million-dollar equipment, trembled slightly as he consulted his tablet. "Sir, we've completed the 3rd comprehensive system analysis. Every circuit has been tested, every connection verified. The electrical systems are functioning within manufacturer specifications. Leonard's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Then why isn't the engine starting, Marcus? We're still investigating that, sir. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush steel. Leonard had perfected this technique over years of management, allowing uncomfortable quiet to fill the space until someone felt compelled to offer more than inadequate half-answers. But this morning, the silence revealed only the limits of his team's capabilities. David Chen, the youngest member of his diagnostic crew, raised his hand hesitantly. Mr. Farias, I've been thinking about the intermittent sensor readings we documented last week. There might be a pattern in the failure sequence that we haven't... Thinking? Leonard's voice cut through the air like a blade. David, I don't pay you to think creatively. I pay you to follow diagnostic protocols and deliver results. Have the protocols identified the problem? No, sir, but then your thinking is irrelevant until the protocols are exhausted. David's shoulders sagged slightly, his enthusiasm deflating under the weight of his boss's disapproval. Around him, other team members exchanged quick glances before returning their attention to their shoes. Leonard noticed these micro-interactions but interpreted them through the lens of his own philosophy. Respect was maintained through controlled intimidation, and sympathy was a luxury he couldn't afford with 46 hours remaining. Thomas Wright, his senior systems analyst, cleared his throat carefully. Sir, I've consulted with Mercedes technical support in Stuttgart. They're suggesting we might need to ship the vehicle back to Germany for factory-level diagnostics. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Leonard turned slowly, his movement deliberate and predatory. Thomas, are you suggesting that Farias premium trucks with our reputation and resources cannot solve a problem that requires shipping a vehicle across an ocean? No, sir, I was just presenting options. I didn't ask for options. I asked for solutions. Leonard surveyed his team, seeing in their faces the same expression he had cultivated deliberately over the years, professional fear masked as respect. These men were competent, he knew. They had solved complex problems before, maintained impossible schedules, and delivered results that had built his reputation. But competence wasn't enough anymore. The Actros demanded something beyond their collective expertise, something that his carefully structured hierarchy seemed unable to produce. Outside the glass walls, the morning sun continued its steady climb, indifferent to the human drama unfolding inside. Pedestrians passed by in their daily routines, unaware that behind the impressive facade of Farias premium trucks, the man who had never failed was confronting the possibility that his greatest success might become his most public failure. The afternoon brought no relief. Leonard paced the perimeter of his office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the workshop floor where his team continued their methodical assault on the silent Actros. From his elevated position, he could observe every frustrated gesture, every consultation of technical manuals, every test that yielded the same maddening result: perfect systems that refused to function as a cohesive whole. His phone had been ringing constantly. Marcus from procurement, explaining why the overnight shipment of replacement sensors had cost triple the usual rate. The European client's project manager, requesting just a brief update on our timeline. His own attorney, reviewing the penalty clauses buried in 40 pages of international contract language that Leonard had signed with such confidence 4 months earlier. Each conversation felt like another small defeat, another crack in the foundation of certainty he had spent 15 years building. Leonard Farias didn't ask for extensions. He didn't negotiate timeline adjustments. He delivered what he promised when he promised it, with the kind of reliability that had made his name synonymous with excellence in an industry where reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. But excellence, he was discovering, had its limits. Through his office window, Leonard watched Marcus directing 2 junior technicians in yet another systematic inspection of the Actros' engine bay. They moved with the careful precision of surgeons, but their body language betrayed the same frustrated helplessness that had been growing throughout his team for weeks. Tools that had solved every previous problem seemed inadequate. Diagnostic computers that could analyze systems more complex than spacecraft were returning data that led nowhere. The irony cut deeper than Leonard cared to admit. He had built his success by eliminating variables, controlling outcomes, and maintaining standards so high that failure became virtually impossible. But control, he was learning, was an illusion that worked only when the problems remained within predictable parameters. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Sarah Martinez, his operations manager, entered with the kind of careful composure that suggested unpleasant news. She had worked for Leonard for 6 years, long enough to read his moods and deliver information with strategic timing. "Leonard," she began, using his first name only when they were alone, "I've been reviewing our options if we need to request an extension." "We're not requesting an extension." "I understand, but I think we should consider—" "Sarah." Leonard turned from the window, his voice carrying the same finality that had ended countless negotiations in his favor. "In 6 years, have I ever failed to deliver what I promised? No, but have I ever asked a client to adjust their expectations to accommodate our limitations?" Sarah hesitated, recognizing the trap in his question. "No, Leonard, you haven't. Then why would we start now?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond its words. Leonard wasn't just defending his track record, he was protecting something more fundamental, more fragile. His identity had become so intertwined with his professional success that the possibility of failure felt like a threat to his very existence. Outside the office window, the afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen across the workshop floor. In 34 hours, European inspectors would arrive expecting to witness American excellence. They would evaluate not just a truck, but Leonard's worthiness as an international partner. Everything he had built, every relationship he had cultivated, every future opportunity he envisioned, all of it balanced on the simple ability to make an engine start. And for the first time in his professional life, Leonard Farias didn't know if he could deliver. 16:55. The evening brought a suffocating quiet to Farias Premium Trucks. Most of the staff had departed, leaving only the skeleton crew that Leonard insisted maintain around-the-clock vigilance over high-priority projects. The Actros sat under harsh fluorescent lighting, its chrome surfaces reflecting the empty workshop like a mirror of Leonard's growing desperation. He had dismissed the day shift with instructions to return early the next morning, their final opportunity to achieve what 4 months of expert analysis had failed to accomplish. Watching them file out, Leonard noticed something in their faces that disturbed him more than their technical failures: resignation. These men, who had once approached every challenge with the confidence that came from working for Leonard Farias, now carried themselves like soldiers retreating from an unwinnable battle. Alone in his office, Leonard stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows that had once represented his triumph over the limitations of his working-class origins. Chicago's skyline glittered beyond the glass, a testament to American ambition and the rewards that came to those who refused to accept mediocrity. He had clawed his way from a small repair shop in his father's garage to this monument of professional success, driven by an unshakable belief that superior effort and uncompromising standards could overcome any obstacle. But tonight, that belief felt as cold and distant as the city lights beyond his window. His cell phone vibrated against the mahogany desk, displaying a number he recognized with growing dread. Klaus Weber, the European project manager, calling from Stuttgart where the workday was just beginning. Leonard let it ring twice before answering, using those seconds to compose himself into the version of Leonard Farias that the world expected: confident, controlled, unflappable. "Klaus," he answered, injecting warmth into his voice that he didn't feel. "Good morning from your side of the Atlantic." "Leonard, my friend," Klaus replied in his precise English, "I am calling to confirm our inspection schedule for tomorrow. My team is very excited to see your famous American efficiency in action." The word efficiency felt like a physical blow. Leonard had built his reputation on that single concept, the ability to deliver complex solutions with clockwork precision. Now it mocked him from across an ocean, spoken by a man who had no idea that American efficiency was currently staring helplessly at $800,000 of silent German engineering. "Everything is proceeding according to plan," Leonard heard himself say, the lie flowing with the same practiced smoothness that had closed countless deals. "We're completing final calibrations now. Your Actros will be performing exactly to specifications." After ending the call, Leonard remained at his desk as the weight of his deception settled around him like a suffocating blanket. He had built his career on transparency with clients, on delivering exactly what he promised without exaggeration or false assurance. But faced with the prospect of public failure, he had chosen the lie that bought him 18 more hours of hope. The irony was bitter. Leonard had always believed that success came to those who faced reality without sentiment, who made hard decisions based on objective assessment rather than wishful thinking. Yet here he sat, clinging to fantasies about miraculous overnight solutions and last-minute technical breakthroughs. Outside his office, the Actros waited in its pool of artificial light, as silent and stubborn as it had been for 123 days. Leonard could see the outline of his reflection superimposed over the truck's massive form, a ghostly double image that seemed to represent everything he had become, impressive from a distance, but hollow when examined closely. For the first time in 15 years, Leonard Farias felt afraid. The morning of reckoning arrived with unseasonable clarity, Chicago's skyline etched against a cloudless sky that seemed to mock Leonard's turmoil with its perfect indifference. By 7 a.m., the workshop buzzed with desperate energy as his team prepared for their final assault on the Actros. Every available diagnostic tool had been wheeled into position around the truck like siege equipment, surrounding a fortress that had already proven impregnable. Leonard emerged from his office having slept fitfully on the leather couch that had served as his bed for the past 3 nights. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain: wrinkled shirt, day-old stubble, eyes that carried the hollow intensity of a man watching his carefully constructed world teetering on the edge of collapse. The European inspection team would arrive in 11 hours. Marcus approached with the morning's technical briefing, his movements careful and deliberate like someone navigating a minefield. "Sir, we've isolated the issue to the engine management system, but the specific failure point remains elusive. Every component tests within normal parameters individually, but the system refuses to integrate." Leonard nodded without speaking, his attention fixed on the Actros, as if force of will alone might coax it to life. Around the truck, his technicians moved with practiced efficiency, but their body language betrayed the futility they all felt. They were following protocols because protocols were all they had left, not because anyone believed those protocols would suddenly yield different results. "What about the factory technical support?" Leonard asked, though he already knew the answer would disappoint him. "Stuttgart has escalated to their highest-level engineers," Marcus replied. "They're suggesting a complete system replacement, but even with overnight shipping, we're looking at 72 hours minimum." The words hit Leonard like physical blows. 72 hours. 3 full days beyond the deadline that would determine whether his company emerged from this crisis intact or became another cautionary tale about American businesses that promised more than they could deliver to international partners. As the morning progressed, Leonard found himself pacing the workshop floor with increasing agitation. He stopped beside workstations to demand updates that revealed no progress. He questioned diagnostic readings that showed the same maddeningly perfect individual component performance. He watched his team, men he had handpicked for their competence and reliability, struggle with a problem that seemed designed to mock everything they knew about automotive systems. By 10 a.m., the facade of professional calm began to crack. "This is unacceptable," Leonard announced to the gathered team, his voice carrying an edge that made several mechanics step back instinctively. "We have the best equipment, the most qualified technicians, and unlimited resources. There is absolutely no excuse for this level of failure." David Chen, the young technician who had suggested investigating sensor patterns the previous day, looked up from his diagnostic tablet. "Sir, if we could just try a different approach to the electrical sequencing." "Different approach?" Leonard's voice rose above the ambient noise of the workshop, causing work to stop throughout the facility. "David, we've spent 4 months and more money than most companies see in a year on different approaches. What we need are results, not more creative thinking." The public rebuke hit David like a slap. His face flushed red as he returned to his station under the watchful eyes of his colleagues, who had all witnessed similar humiliations over the years, but never delivered with such desperate cruelty. Leonard continued his verbal assault, moving from station to station like a general berating troops who had failed in battle. Years of carefully controlled leadership dissolved into raw frustration as he confronted the first problem that his management style couldn't intimidate into submission. The Actros remained silent, indifferent to human anger and immune to the force of Leonard's will. The verbal assault continued for another 20 minutes, Leonard's voice echoing through the workshop with increasing desperation disguised as authority. Thomas Wright received a withering critique of his diagnostic methodology. Marcus was questioned about his certification credentials. Even Sarah, who had tried to offer logistical alternatives, found herself defending decisions she had made under Leonard's direct supervision. The atmosphere in the workshop grew toxic. Men who had once worked with collaborative efficiency now moved with the careful isolation of individuals protecting themselves from their boss's escalating rage. Tools were handled with exaggerated precision, conversations reduced to essential technical exchanges, and eye contact avoided whenever Leonard passed within speaking distance. But Leonard couldn't see what he was destroying. Consumed by the approaching deadline and the prospect of public failure, he interpreted his team's withdrawal as further evidence of their inadequacy rather than a natural response to his increasingly erratic leadership. The man who had built his reputation on creating environments where excellence flourished was systematically dismantling the very culture that had made his success possible. At 11:30 a.m., as Leonard paused between stations to check his watch obsessively, something outside the main entrance caught his attention through the glass walls. An elderly man stood on the sidewalk, hands clasped behind his back, studying the workshop with the patient intensity of someone solving a puzzle. He wore simple clothes, khaki pants, a faded blue shirt, and a lightweight jacket that had seen better years. His gray hair was neatly combed but clearly cut at home rather than in the expensive salons Leonard frequented. Leonard watched the man for several minutes, irritated by this uninvited scrutiny of his operation. The stranger didn't move like a potential customer or curious passerby. Instead, he seemed to be analyzing something, his head tilted slightly as if listening to sounds that others couldn't hear. When the man pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and began writing, Leonard's irritation shifted toward suspicion. "Security," Leonard called to the guard station near the entrance. "There's someone outside who's been watching us for the past 10 minutes. Find out what he wants." Through the glass, Leonard observed the security guard approaching the elderly man. They exchanged words, the stranger gesturing toward the workshop, while the guard shook his head with the standard corporate politeness that kept unwanted visitors at bay. But instead of leaving, the elderly man said something that caused the guard to pause, then speak into his radio. Moments later, the guard was walking back toward the entrance with visible confusion on his face. "Mr. Farias," the guard called as he approached Leonard. "The gentleman outside says he knows what's wrong with your truck. He specifically mentioned the Mercedes that won't start." Leonard felt his frustration crystallize into anger. After 4 months of highly paid experts failing to solve his problem, some random stranger was claiming superior knowledge based on casual observation through glass walls. It was exactly the kind of presumptuous interference that Leonard had spent his career eliminating from his professional environment. "Tell him we have the situation under control," Leonard replied curtly. "And that Farias Premium Trucks doesn't accept unsolicited technical advice from the sidewalk." The guard nodded and began walking back toward the entrance, but Leonard's attention was drawn to the elderly man's reaction. Instead of leaving when dismissed, The stranger wrote something on a piece of paper, handed it to the guard, and pointed once more toward the actros before walking away with unhurried dignity. Despite himself, Leonard was curious about what the man had written. Minutes later, the guard delivered a small piece of paper torn from the stranger's notebook. In careful handwriting, it contained a single line. Intermittent ground fault in the engine rotation sensor circuit. Check the splice connection behind the firewall. Leonard stared at the note, his anger warring with desperate hope. Every technical expert had examined that exact system multiple times, but none had identified the specific failure point this stranger was suggesting. Against every instinct of professional pride, Leonard felt something he had almost forgotten, the willingness to accept help from an unlikely source. Leonard stood motionless for several seconds, the piece of paper trembling slightly in his hands. Around him, the workshop continued its futile assault on the actros, but his attention had narrowed to the careful handwriting that suggested a solution none of his experts had considered. The specificity of the diagnosis, intermittent ground fault, rotation sensor circuit, splice connection behind the firewall, carried the precision of genuine expertise rather than casual speculation. His rational mind fought against what felt like capitulation to desperation. Leonard Farias had built his reputation by trusting qualified professionals with documented credentials, not random strangers who offered unsolicited advice from sidewalks. But his rational mind was losing the battle against a more primitive instinct, the survival mechanism that recognized when conventional approaches had failed and unconventional solutions deserved consideration. "Marcus," Leonard called, his voice carefully controlled despite the chaos in his thoughts. "Come here." His lead technician approached warily, still smarting from the morning's public criticism and uncertain whether this summons would bring more humiliation or actual direction. Leonard handed him the paper without explanation, watching Marcus's face as he read the technical diagnosis. "Sir," Marcus said after a moment, "we've tested the rotation sensor multiple times. The diagnostic readings show normal function. Have you physically examined the splice connection behind the firewall?" Marcus hesitated, consulting his memory of their exhaustive diagnostic process. "The sensors tested within parameters, so we focused on other systems, but—" He paused, recognizing something significant in his own words. "An intermittent ground fault would be invisible to most diagnostic equipment unless it occurred during testing." Leonard felt his pulse quicken. For 4 months, his team had relied on computer diagnostics that could identify failed components but might miss intermittent connection problems that occurred randomly. It was exactly the kind of simple mechanical issue that sophisticated equipment could overlook while pursuing more complex electronic failures. "Get the stranger back here," Leonard said, the words emerging before his professional pride could prevent them. "Now!" The security guard looked uncertain. "Sir, he walked away about 10 minutes ago. I'm not sure where." "Find him," Leonard commanded, his voice carrying the urgency of a man who had just glimpsed salvation. "Check the surrounding blocks. Bring him back here immediately." As the guard hurried toward the exit, Leonard felt the eyes of his entire team focused on him with undisguised confusion. In 15 years of operation, no one had ever seen Leonard Farias seek technical assistance from unauthorized sources, much less dispatch security to retrieve random pedestrians for consultation. But Leonard was beyond caring about appearances or maintaining consistent leadership philosophy. The European inspection team would arrive in less than 9 hours. His reputation, his contracts, and his company's future hung in the balance. If an elderly stranger with a notebook possessed knowledge that his certified experts lacked, Leonard was prepared to abandon every principle of professional hierarchy that had previously defined his management style. Through the glass walls, he watched the security guard questioning pedestrians, showing them something, probably a description of the elderly man. Several people shook their heads and continued walking. Others pointed in different directions, offering conflicting information about which way the stranger had gone. Leonard began pacing again, but this time his movement carried anticipation rather than frustration. For the first time in 4 months, Someone had offered a specific, actionable diagnosis rather than vague theories or requests for additional time. The solution might be wrong, but it was definitive enough to test quickly, and testing offered the possibility of resolution rather than endless analysis. Minutes stretched with agonizing slowness as Leonard alternated between watching the entrance and checking his watch. Each second that passed without the guard's return felt like an opportunity slipping away, a potential solution walking farther from his reach. Then, through the glass entrance, Leonard saw two figures approaching. The security guard walked alongside the elderly stranger, gesturing toward the workshop as they covered the distance from sidewalk to door. The older man moved without hurry despite the guard's obvious urgency, his calm pace suggesting someone who understood that rushing rarely improved outcomes. The elderly man entered Farias Premium Trucks with the unhurried composure of someone who had spent decades in industrial environments. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease as he removed a worn baseball cap, revealing gray hair that had been carefully combed despite its obvious need for professional attention. Up close, Leonard could see details that hadn't been visible through the glass. Work boots that were old but well-maintained, fingernails that carried the permanent stains of someone who had worked with machinery for most of his adult life, and eyes that assessed the workshop with the systematic attention of an experienced professional. "Walter Hayes," the man introduced himself, extending a hand that felt like seasoned leather when Leonard shook it. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone who chose words carefully, without the rapid-fire urgency that characterized most of Leonard's interactions with vendors and consultants. Leonard found himself momentarily uncertain about how to proceed. His usual approach to new technical consultants involved reviewing credentials, checking references, and establishing clear hierarchies of authority. But Walter Hayes offered none of the traditional markers of professional legitimacy: no business cards, no certificates, no expensive diagnostic equipment. Just a small notebook, a mechanical pencil, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowledge rather than presentation. "Mr. Hayes," Leonard began, struggling to balance desperation with maintaining some semblance of professional control. "You indicated that you might know what's wrong with our Mercedes." Walter nodded toward the Actros, studying the massive truck with the same patient intensity Leonard had observed from outside. 42 years working on heavy equipment," he said without boasting. "Started when diagnostics meant listening to engines and feeling vibrations through your hands. Computers are helpful, but they can't hear what experience teaches you to recognize." Leonard's team had gathered in a loose semicircle around the conversation, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. Marcus stood closest, still holding the paper with Walter's handwritten diagnosis, clearly uncertain whether to treat this development as legitimate consultation or desperate theater. Walter walked slowly around the Actros, his movements deliberate and methodical. He paused at specific points, near the engine bay, beside the electronic control modules, underneath the chassis where diagnostic connections clustered like mechanical nerve centers. At each stop, he seemed to be listening to something others couldn't hear, processing information through senses that sophisticated equipment couldn't replicate. 4 months of testing, Walter observed, his statement somewhere between question and confirmation. All the systems check out individually, but the engine won't start. Intermittent problem that doesn't show up consistently on diagnostic scans. "That's correct," Leonard replied, surprised by how accurately Walter had summarized their situation without being briefed on their efforts. Walter knelt beside the truck's front wheel well, his practiced eye following wiring harnesses that disappeared behind panels and protective covers. "Modern diagnostics look for obvious failures, broken circuits, failed components, clear electronic signatures. But mechanical connections fail in ways that computers can't always detect, especially when the failure is intermittent." He stood and faced Leonard directly, his expression serious but not judgmental. "I'd like to look at the splice connection behind the engine firewall. If I'm right, it's a 10-minute fix with basic tools. If I'm wrong, you've lost 10 minutes you probably can't spare." Leonard felt the weight of his team's attention, the pressure of approaching deadline, and the enormous risk of allowing an uncredentialed stranger to work on equipment worth more than most people's houses. Every rational business principle he had followed for 15 years argued against this decision. But rational business principles had failed him completely. "Show us," Leonard said. Walter approached the actros with the deliberate movements of someone who understood that haste often created more problems than it solved. He circled the massive truck once more, this time running his fingers along wiring harnesses and connection points with the tactile sensitivity of a physician examining a patient. Leonard's team watched in fascination as the elderly man employed diagnostic techniques they hadn't seen since their earliest training. Touch, sound, and visual inspection rather than electronic analysis. "May I borrow some basic tools?" Walter asked, his tone respectful but confident. "Nothing fancy. Just a socket set, electrical tape, and a test light." Marcus hesitated, looking to Leonard for approval before gathering the requested equipment. The simple tools looked almost primitive compared to the sophisticated diagnostic computers surrounding the truck, but Walter handled them with the familiarity of someone who had solved countless problems with far less equipment than Leonard's team took for granted. Walter positioned himself beside the engine compartment, his movements economical and precise. "The rotation sensor tells the engine management computer when to fire the cylinders," he explained as he worked, his voice carrying the teaching tone of someone who had trained younger mechanics for decades. "If the sensor gets intermittent signal due to a poor ground connection, the computer gets confused timing information." Leonard found himself leaning closer, drawn by Walter's methodical approach despite his usual preference for maintaining executive distance from hands-on technical work. Around him, his team pressed forward with genuine curiosity, their morning frustration temporarily replaced by professional interest in watching a master craftsman at work. "The tricky part," Walter continued, loosening connections behind the firewall panel, "is that intermittent problems don't show up on diagnostic scans unless they happen during testing. The sensor tests fine when it's getting good connection, but fails randomly when vibration or temperature changes affect the bad splice." With careful precision, Walter exposed a section of wiring that had been tested multiple times but never physically examined in detail. His weathered fingers traced the harness until he reached a point where multiple wires joined together, protected by electrical tape that had been applied according to factory specifications. "There," Walter said quietly, pointing to a connection that looked identical to dozens of others throughout the engine bay. That splice was installed correctly, but over time the solder joint developed what we call a cold connection. Makes contact most of the time, but loses connection when conditions are just right, or just wrong, depending on your perspective. Leonard watched as Walter carefully unwrapped the electrical tape, revealing a junction that appeared normal to untrained eyes but showed subtle signs of corrosion when examined closely. The solder joint had indeed developed the hairline separation that Walter had diagnosed from outside the building, an almost invisible flaw that had defeated 4 months of sophisticated analysis. "How did you know?" Leonard asked, genuine amazement overriding his usual need to maintain professional composure. Walter smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face with warmth that had been hidden beneath his serious concentration. 42 years of listening to machines tell their stories. Modern diagnostics are wonderful, but they can't hear what experience teaches you to recognize. That particular failure has a signature, the way it affects other systems, the pattern of when it works versus when it doesn't. Working with practiced efficiency, Walter cleaned the corroded connection, applied fresh solder, and reassembled the junction with the kind of mechanical precision that spoke of thousands of similar repairs performed over decades of professional experience. His movements were economical but thorough, each step executed with the confidence of someone who had solved this exact problem many times before. "Give it a try," Walter said, stepping back from the engine compartment and wiping his hands on a clean shop rag that Marcus had provided. Leonard felt his heart racing as Marcus climbed into the cab and turned the ignition key. For 4 months, that simple action had produced nothing but electronic silence and frustrated technicians. The Actros had become a monument to the limits of modern diagnostic technology and expert analysis. The engine turned over once, twice, then roared to life with the deep, powerful sound of German engineering operating exactly as designed. The workshop fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the steady rumble of the Actros engine. For several moments, no one moved or spoke, as if the sound itself might prove to be an auditory hallucination that would vanish if anyone dared to acknowledge it. Leonard stared at the truck with an expression that shifted between relief and bewilderment, his mind struggling to process how 4 months of expert failure had been resolved in less than 20 minutes by a stranger with a notebook. Marcus sat behind the wheel, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he listened to the engine's smooth operation, with the wonder of someone witnessing resurrection. Around the truck, Leonard's team exchanged glances that mixed professional amazement with something more uncomfortable, the recognition that their sophisticated approach had been fundamentally inadequate. Leonard turned to Walter, who was quietly returning the borrowed tools to their proper places with the automatic courtesy of someone who had worked in shared workshops his entire life. The elderly man's expression remained calm, almost matter-of-fact, as if solving problems that had stumped entire teams of experts was simply part of his normal routine. "How much do I owe you?" Leonard asked, reaching for his wallet with the assumption that Walter's assistance came with a consulting fee that would reflect the enormous value of his contribution. Walter paused in organizing the tools, his weathered hands stilling as he considered Leonard's question. "I don't want money," he replied after a moment, his voice carrying quiet dignity. "But I would like to ask you for something else." Leonard waited, prepared to offer almost anything to the man who had just saved his reputation and possibly his entire business. Equipment access, future consulting opportunities, references to other companies, whatever Walter requested, seemed reasonable given the magnitude of his contribution. "I'd like a job," Walter said simply. "Been out of work for 8 months now. Used to supervise maintenance for Consolidated Freight until they downsized and decided my experience was less valuable than my age. I can fix things, Mr. Farias. Not just diagnose them, but actually fix them." The request hit Leonard with unexpected force. In his relief over the Actros solution, he hadn't considered Walter's personal circumstances or what might have motivated a clearly skilled professional to offer unsolicited assistance to a stranger's business. Now, looking at Walter's careful dignity and worn but clean clothes, Leonard understood that he was facing a man whose competence had been dismissed by an industry that valued credentials over capability. Leonard's usual hiring process involved extensive background checks, reference verification, and multiple interviews designed to ensure that new employees met Farias Premium Truck's exacting standards for both technical competence and cultural fit. Walter Hayes possessed demonstrated technical excellence, but none of the traditional qualifications that Leonard's human resources protocols required. "Mr. Hayes," Leonard began carefully, "I appreciate what you've done here today, but our hiring process typically involves—" "I understand," Walter interrupted gently, his tone free of resentment but carrying the resignation of someone who had heard similar explanations before. "Just thought I'd ask." "Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places." Leonard felt his team's attention focused on this exchange with uncomfortable intensity. David Chen, the young technician who had suggested investigating sensor patterns that morning, looked particularly engaged, as if Walter's dismissal by corporate downsizing echoed fears about his own professional vulnerability. Walter began walking toward the exit, his unhurried pace suggesting acceptance rather than disappointment. He had solved Leonard's problem, been thanked politely, and received the kind of courteous rejection that preserved everyone's dignity while maintaining established boundaries. But as Leonard watched Walter approach the glass doors, something fundamental shifted in his thinking. This man had accomplished in minutes what his entire expert team had failed to achieve in months. Walter's age and lack of current employment weren't indicators of diminished capability. They were consequences of an industry that discarded valuable experience in favor of easier-to-categorize alternatives. "Walter!" Leonard called out, his voice carrying across the workshop with enough authority to stop all activity. "Wait." Walter stopped at the sound of his name, but didn't turn immediately, his shoulders carrying the weight of someone who had experienced too many moments when hope was raised, only to be carefully deflated by professional courtesy. When he finally faced Leonard, his expression remained neutral, guarded against disappointment, but still open to possibility. Leonard felt the weight of his team's attention as he walked toward Walter, each step carrying him further from the hiring protocols that had governed 15 years of business decisions. The Actros continued its steady rumble behind him, a constant reminder that conventional wisdom had its limitations and that excellence sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. "I apologize," Leonard said, his voice carrying genuine regret that surprised even him with its sincerity. "What I was about to say about our hiring process was exactly the kind of thinking that would have kept you outside that door while we continued failing to solve a problem you diagnosed from the sidewalk." Walter's expression softened slightly, but he remained cautious. "I appreciate that, Mr. Farias, but I understand how businesses work. Insurance requirements, liability concerns, documented qualifications, there are good reasons for following established procedures." "Are there?" Leonard asked, more to himself than to Walter. He gestured toward the Actros, still running smoothly after 4 months of silence. "Because our established procedures just cost us enormous amounts of time, money, and credibility, while you solved our problem with 42 years of experience and 10 minutes of actual work." Around them, the workshop remained unusually quiet as Leonard's team absorbed this public acknowledgement that their collective expertise had been insufficient. But instead of defensiveness, Leonard detected something that resembled relief in their faces, recognition that their failure wasn't personal inadequacy, but systemic limitation. Leonard extended his hand toward Walter, a gesture that felt more significant than simple courtesy. "Walter Hayes, I would like to formally offer you a position with Farias Premium Trucks, Senior Diagnostic Specialist, full benefits, salary commensurate with the value you just demonstrated. No probationary period, no extended background checks, no bureaucratic delays." Walter studied Leonard's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine offers and polite gestures. "Mr. Farias, I'm 72 years old. Most companies see that as a liability rather than an asset." "Then most companies are making the same mistake I almost made," Leonard replied. "Age isn't a liability when it comes with knowledge that can't be taught in schools or acquired through certification programs. You have something my team needs and, frankly, something I need to learn." The admission felt strange coming from Leonard's mouth. For 15 years, he had positioned himself as the source of knowledge and standards within his organization, the final authority on technical decisions and business strategy. But Walter's demonstration had revealed gaps in his understanding that formal education and business success couldn't fill. Walter was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands adjusting the notebook in his jacket pocket as he considered Leonard's offer. "If I accept," he said finally, "I'd want to work with your existing team, not replace anyone. These men have knowledge I respect, even if they miss this particular problem. Good mechanics learn from each other." Leonard felt something unexpected, respect for Walter's concern about his team's job security. In Leonard's experience, most consultants positioned themselves as superior alternatives to existing staff, eager to demonstrate their value by highlighting others' inadequacies. Walter's approach suggested a collaborative philosophy that Leonard had rarely encountered in business relationships. "Agreed," Leonard said. "You'd be working alongside our current diagnostic specialists, sharing knowledge rather than displacing it." Walter smiled then, the expression transforming his entire face with warmth that had been hidden beneath professional caution. "In that case, Mr. Farias, I accept your offer. When would you like me to start?" Leonard glanced at his watch, remembering the European inspection team that would arrive in less than 8 hours. "How about right now? We have some very important visitors coming this afternoon, and I'd like them to meet the man who solved our impossible problem." As Walter shook Leonard's hand with a grip that spoke of decades spent working with tools and machinery, Leonard felt something he hadn't experienced in years, humility mixed with genuine excitement about learning from someone whose knowledge had been acquired through experience rather than formal instruction. 1702. The afternoon transformation of Farias. Premium trucks felt like watching a different company emerge from behind the morning's desperate facade. Word of Walter's diagnostic success had spread through the facility with the speed of important news, creating an atmosphere of renewed confidence that Leonard hadn't felt in months. The Actros continued its steady operation, no longer a monument to failure, but proof that unconventional solutions sometimes delivered results that sophisticated systems couldn't achieve. Leonard found himself in the unusual position of observer rather than director as Walter worked alongside his existing team. The elderly man moved through the workshop with quiet authority, examining other diagnostic challenges that had been postponed while everyone focused on the Actros crisis. His approach was methodical but collaborative, asking questions that revealed gaps in standard procedures without criticizing the competence of Leonard's technicians. "David," Walter said to the young technician who had suggested investigating sensor patterns that morning, "tell me about your idea regarding electrical sequencing. I heard Mr. Farias dismiss it, but I'd like to understand your thinking." David glanced nervously at Leonard before responding, clearly uncertain whether Walter's interest represented genuine consultation or potential trouble. Leonard nodded encouragingly, recognizing that his morning outburst had created exactly the kind of fear that prevented good ideas from surfacing when they were most needed. "I noticed that the diagnostic failures seemed to cluster around specific environmental conditions," David explained, gaining confidence as Walter listened with obvious attention. "Temperature changes, humidity levels, even vibrations from other equipment seemed to correlate with when the Actros would show intermittent readings." Walter smiled with approval. "Exactly right. Environmental factors affect electrical connections in ways that computer diagnostics often miss. Your pattern recognition was spot on. It just needed someone to connect it to specific mechanical possibilities." Leonard watched this exchange with growing understanding of how dramatically his leadership style had interfered with his team's effectiveness. David possessed valuable analytical skills, but Leonard's insistence on following rigid protocols had prevented those skills from contributing to solutions. Walter's collaborative approach was drawing out insights that had been present all along, but suppressed by hierarchical intimidation. Marcus approached with a tablet displaying diagnostic readings from a semi-trailer that had been problematic for weeks. "Walter, would you mind looking at these sensor patterns? We've been chasing an intermittent brake system fault that seems to vanish whenever we try to isolate it." Walter studied the data with the same patient attention he had given the Actros, but instead of immediately offering solutions, he asked questions that helped Marcus think through the problem systematically. "What external factors might affect brake sensor performance? When do the failures occur most frequently? Have you physically inspected the connections, or relied primarily on electronic diagnostics?" Leonard realized he was witnessing something he had never seen in his own facility: genuine mentorship rather than top-down instruction. Walter wasn't trying to demonstrate superior knowledge. He was teaching Leonard's team to think more comprehensively about diagnostic challenges. The result was collaborative problem-solving that leveraged everyone's expertise rather than replacing it. At 4 p.m., Leonard received the call he had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Klaus Weber and his European inspection team had arrived at O'Hare International Airport and would reach the facility within the hour. Leonard felt a familiar surge of pre-presentation anxiety, but this time it was mixed with confidence rather than desperation. "Gentlemen," Leonard announced to the assembled team, "our European partners will be here shortly for the final inspection. I want everyone to understand that today's success reflects the best of what this company can achieve when we combine technical expertise with open-minded problem-solving." He looked directly at Walter, who was helping David troubleshoot the brake sensor issue with patient encouragement. We're about to demonstrate not just a functioning truck, but a diagnostic capability that our international partners haven't seen anywhere else. Mr. Hayes, I'd like you to be present for the inspection to explain your diagnostic approach." Walter looked up from the sensor readings with surprise. "Mr. Farias, these are your clients and your contracts. I'm happy to stay in the background." "No," Leonard said firmly. "Today proved that the best solutions come from recognizing excellence wherever it exists, not just from following established hierarchies. Our European partners need to see that American innovation includes the wisdom to value experience over credentials." As Leonard prepared for the most important presentation of his professional life, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: excitement about learning from his own team rather than simply directing their efforts. Walter Hayes had fixed more than a truck. He had demonstrated the possibility of leadership through collaboration rather than control. The sound of approaching vehicles in the parking lot announced that the moment of truth had arrived. 17:03. The European inspection team entered Farias Premium Trucks with the formal precision that Leonard had come to associate with high-stakes international business. Klaus Weber led a group of 3 technical specialists, each carrying tablets and diagnostic equipment that spoke to their intention to conduct thorough verification rather than ceremonial approval. Their movements were efficient and professional, but Leonard detected the slight skepticism that came from European engineers evaluating American claims about German machinery. "Leonard," Klaus said warmly, extending a hand while his colleagues began their preliminary assessment of the facility. "Your workshop is every bit as impressive as we had hoped. We are eager to see this famous American efficiency applied to our Actros." Leonard felt a surge of gratitude that the morning's crisis hadn't been visible to these visitors. The workshop now hummed with renewed confidence, his team working with the collaborative energy that Walter's presence had somehow catalyzed. The Actros sat in the center bay, its engine running smoothly, ready to demonstrate the technical excellence that would validate months of international negotiations. "Klaus, before we begin the formal inspection, I'd like you to meet someone who represents the depth of expertise that makes projects like this possible," Leonard said, gesturing toward Walter, who approached with his characteristic unhurried composure. Walter shook hands with each member of the European team, his calm professionalism creating immediate respect despite his simple work clothes and lack of formal credentials. Leonard noticed that Klaus and his colleagues responded to Walter's quiet confidence with the kind of attention they typically reserved for senior technical executives. "Mr. Hayes recently joined our diagnostic team," Leonard explained, choosing his words carefully to represent Walter's contribution without revealing the morning's desperation. His approach to complex electrical problems has proven invaluable for challenging diagnostic situations. Klaus nodded politely, then moved toward the Actros with the focused attention of someone conducting serious business evaluation. "We are particularly interested in your diagnostic methodology for intermittent electrical faults," he said, addressing Walter directly. "These problems have challenged even our factory engineers in Stuttgart." Walter smiled with genuine warmth. "Intermittent problems require patience and old-fashioned detective work," he replied. "Modern diagnostic computers are excellent tools, but they can't replace systematic thinking about how mechanical systems behave under real-world conditions." As Klaus's team began their technical evaluation, Leonard watched Walter explain his diagnostic approach with the same collaborative teaching style he had demonstrated with David and Marcus. Instead of claiming superior expertise, Walter engaged the European engineers in professional conversation about diagnostic philosophy and mechanical troubleshooting techniques. "This connection behind the firewall," Walter said, pointing to the repair he had completed that morning, "represents the kind of failure that sophisticated equipment might overlook. The soldered joint had developed what we call a cold connection, intermittent contact that would test fine under laboratory conditions but fail randomly under operating stresses. One of Klaus's technical specialists, a serious man named Henrik, examined the repair with obvious interest. "We have seen similar problems in our German facilities," he acknowledged. "Your diagnostic approach, combining electronic analysis with physical inspection, is more comprehensive than many shops attempt. Leonard felt a deep satisfaction as he watched Walter earn genuine respect from engineers who were known for their exacting standards. This wasn't polite acknowledgement of a lucky guess, but professional recognition of systematic expertise that complemented their own technical knowledge. The formal inspection proceeded smoothly, with Klaus's team documenting the Actros's performance across all specified parameters. Every system functioned exactly to manufacturer specifications. The engine operated with the smooth precision expected from German engineering, and the diagnostic procedures demonstrated technical capabilities that exceeded the contract requirements. As the evaluation concluded, Klaus turned to Leonard with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something that looked like surprise. "Leonard, this level of diagnostic sophistication is impressive even by European standards. Your ability to solve complex intermittent problems suggests technical depth that will be valuable for our future North American operations." Leonard felt a moment of professional triumph, but it was tempered by awareness of how close he had come to complete failure. Without Walter's intervention, this inspection would have been a disaster that ended his international ambitions and damaged his reputation throughout the industry. "Klaus," Leonard said, making a decision that felt both risky and necessary, "I want to be completely honest about today's success. Until this morning, that truck had been silent for 4 months. Mr. Hayes diagnosed and solved the problem that our entire expert team had been unable to identify." The admission created a moment of uncomfortable silence, but Leonard continued, "I'm telling you this because I want our partnership to be based on transparency rather than false impressions. American excellence includes the wisdom to recognize expertise wherever it exists, even when it challenges our assumptions about credentials and conventional approaches." 17 Numero 4. Klaus studied Leonard with the careful attention of someone reassessing initial impressions. The other European engineers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from professional courtesy to genuine interest as they processed Leonard's unexpected candor. In Klaus's experience, American executives typically emphasized their successes while minimizing any factors that might suggest vulnerability or dependence on others. "You are telling us," Klaus said slowly, "that your most challenging technical problem was solved by someone who was not part of your original team." "That's correct," Leonard replied, feeling exposed but oddly liberated by his commitment to honesty. "Mr. Hayes observed our situation from outside, diagnosed the problem accurately, and fixed it in less than 20 minutes after 4 months of expert analysis had failed." Henrik, the serious technical specialist, turned to Walter with renewed attention. "What was your previous experience with Mercedes heavy truck systems?" Walter smiled with quiet confidence. 42 years working on all types of heavy equipment, including Mercedes, Volvo, Freightliner, and others. Started when diagnostic meant listening to engines and feeling vibrations. Computers are helpful, but mechanical intuition still matters for complex intermittent problems." Klaus nodded thoughtfully, his business instincts recognizing something valuable in Walter's approach. "In our European operations, we have learned that the best diagnostic capabilities combine advanced technology with experienced human judgment. Many facilities rely too heavily on one approach or the other." Leonard felt a surge of vindication for his decision to hire Walter, despite conventional hiring protocols. The Europeans weren't viewing Walter's age and unconventional background as limitations. They were recognizing his experience as exactly the kind of human expertise that complemented modern diagnostic technology. "Mr. Hayes," Klaus continued, "would you be interested in consulting on some diagnostic challenges we face in our German facilities? We have intermittent problems with some of our newer electronic systems that have frustrated our factory engineers." Walter looked to Leonard before responding, a gesture of professional courtesy that didn't go unnoticed by the European team. "If Mr. Farias approves, I'd be honored to share what I've learned over the years." Leonard felt a moment of professional pride that had nothing to do with his own accomplishments. Walter's expertise was being recognized by engineers who represented the highest technical standards in the industry, validating Leonard's decision to value capability over credentials. "Absolutely," Leonard said. "In fact, I'd like to propose that our collaboration includes regular knowledge exchange between our diagnostic teams. American practical experience combined with European engineering precision could benefit everyone involved." As the inspection concluded with signed approvals and contract confirmations, Leonard realized that the day's crisis had produced something more valuable than crisis resolution. Walter's presence had demonstrated the possibility of leadership that drew excellence from unexpected sources rather than simply imposing predetermined standards. Klaus shook hands with both Leonard and Walter as his team prepared to depart. "Leonard, today's demonstration has convinced us that Farias Premium Trucks possesses exactly the kind of technical depth our North American expansion requires. But more importantly, your willingness to acknowledge Mr. Hayes's contribution suggests the kind of honest partnership we value in long-term business relationships." After the Europeans departed, Leonard stood in his workshop surrounded by a team that somehow felt more cohesive than it had that morning, despite, or perhaps because of, the day's dramatic revelations about their collective limitations. Walter was quietly organizing diagnostic notes, while David and Marcus discussed sensor troubleshooting techniques with the enthusiasm of students who had discovered new approaches to familiar problems. Leonard realized that Walter hadn't just solved a technical problem, he had demonstrated an entirely different approach to leadership and expertise. Instead of demanding recognition for superior knowledge, Walter had shared his capabilities in ways that elevated everyone around him. For the first time in 15 years, Leonard felt curious about what he might learn rather than anxious about what he needed to control. The weeks following the European inspection brought changes to Farias Premium Trucks that Leonard hadn't anticipated when he hired Walter. The elderly mechanic's influence extended far beyond his diagnostic expertise, creating ripple effects throughout the organization that challenged Leonard's assumptions about leadership and professional development. Walter arrived each morning at 6:30, 30 minutes before the official start of the workday, and spent that time reviewing diagnostic logs and maintenance schedules with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understood that prevention was more valuable than emergency repair. Leonard, who had always been first to arrive at his own facility, found himself looking forward to these early morning conversations where Walter shared insights about equipment maintenance that formal business education had never addressed. "Mr. Farias," Walter said one morning, reviewing a maintenance report while sipping coffee from a thermos he brought from home, "I've noticed some patterns in your hydraulic system failures that might be preventable with minor scheduling adjustments." Leonard set down his own coffee, prepared to listen with the attention he was learning to give Walter's observations. "What kind of patterns?" "Hydraulic failures tend to cluster around high-demand periods when your crews are pushing equipment beyond normal operating parameters," Walter explained, spreading maintenance logs across the break room table. "Not mechanical abuse, just the natural tendency to defer routine maintenance when business is urgent." Leonard studied the documents, recognizing accuracy in Walter's assessment that he found both valuable and uncomfortable. His business model depended on meeting tight deadlines and exceeding client expectations, but Walter was suggesting that this approach sometimes created long-term problems that exceeded short-term benefits. "What would you recommend?" Walter smiled with the patience of someone who had spent decades explaining mechanical realities to business-focused managers. "Preventive maintenance scheduling that accounts for high-demand periods. Instead of deferring routine service when business is urgent, we increase maintenance frequency before those periods. Equipment performs better under stress when it's been properly prepared." The suggestion represented more than mechanical advice. It was a philosophical shift from reactive problem-solving to proactive system management. Leonard had built his reputation on responding brilliantly to crises, but Walter was demonstrating the value of preventing crises through systematic attention to underlying conditions. "Implement it," Leonard said, making a decision that felt both obvious and revolutionary. whatever scheduling changes you think are necessary. Over the following days, Leonard watched Walter work with his team in ways that continued to challenge his understanding of effective management. Instead of issuing directives based on superior knowledge, Walter asked questions that helped younger mechanics develop their own diagnostic capabilities. David Chen, who had been demoralized by Leonard's morning outburst weeks earlier, was now approaching complex problems with confidence that came from Walter's patient mentoring. "Walter's teaching us to think differently about diagnostics," David told Leonard during a lunch break. "Not just following procedures, but understanding why the procedures work and when they might not be sufficient." Leonard realized that Walter was accomplishing something Leonard had never achieved despite 15 years of management experience, developing his team's capabilities rather than simply directing their efforts. The result was a workforce that approached problems with collaborative intelligence instead of hierarchical dependency. The transformation wasn't limited to technical issues. Leonard's own leadership style was evolving as he observed Walter's approach to workplace relationships. The elderly mechanic treated everyone with the same quiet respect, from senior technicians to part-time administrative staff. He listened more than he spoke, offered suggestions rather than commands, and gave credit to others for successful outcomes. One afternoon, Leonard overheard Walter responding to a question from Thomas Wright about a complex transmission problem. Instead of immediately providing the solution, Walter guided Thomas through diagnostic reasoning that led to the correct conclusion. "You figured that out perfectly," Walter told Thomas when the diagnosis was complete. "Experience teaches pattern recognition, but you have to trust your own analytical capabilities." Leonard felt something that surprised him with its intensity: professional jealousy mixed with genuine admiration. Walter was earning the kind of respect from Leonard's team that Leonard had always commanded through authority rather than inspiration. But instead of feeling threatened, Leonard found himself curious about learning Walter's collaborative approach to leadership. That evening, Leonard asked Walter to stay after the other staff departed, intending to discuss business matters, but finding himself drawn into more personal conversation. "Walter," Leonard began carefully, "you've accomplished more positive change in 3 weeks than I managed in 15 years of supposedly excellent management. How do you do it?" Walter considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness, clearly choosing his words to avoid criticism while providing honest insight. "Mr. Farias, you built an excellent company by maintaining high standards and demanding results, but people work better when they feel valued for their capabilities rather than afraid of their limitations." The observation struck Leonard with unexpected force. He had always believed that excellence came from pressure, that superior results required superior demands. But Walter was demonstrating that excellence could also emerge from collaboration, that people produced their best work when they felt trusted rather than monitored. "I've been thinking about something," Leonard said, making a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. "Would you be interested in becoming a partner rather than an employee?" Walter set down his coffee cup with the same deliberate care he applied to all his actions, his weathered hands still as he processed Leonard's unexpected offer. The workshop around them had settled into evening quiet, most equipment powered down for the night, leaving only the ambient sounds of a building at rest and the distant hum of Chicago traffic beyond the glass walls. "Mr. Farias," Walter said slowly, his voice carrying the caution of someone who had learned to examine opportunities for hidden complications. "That's a generous offer, but I'm not sure I understand what you're proposing." Leonard felt the weight of his own surprise at the suggestion. He had built Farias premium trucks through 15 years of sole ownership, maintaining complete control over every business decision and strategic direction. Partnership meant sharing authority he had never shared, trusting judgment he had never trusted, and accepting accountability to someone whose business philosophy he was only beginning to understand. "I'm proposing that you become an equity partner with decision-making authority over technical operations and staff development," Leonard said, the words feeling strange but somehow necessary as he spoke them. "Your diagnostic expertise and leadership approach have demonstrated value that extends far beyond what any employee salary could compensate. Walter studied Leonard's face with the same analytical attention he brought to mechanical problems, clearly assessing whether this offer represented genuine business judgment or emotional reaction to recent events. "Leonard, I appreciate what you're saying, but 3 weeks ago you'd never heard my name. Partnership is a long-term commitment that shouldn't be based on solving one diagnostic problem." Leonard appreciated Walter's caution, recognizing it as evidence of the practical wisdom that had made his technical contributions so valuable. But Leonard's offer wasn't impulsive gratitude. It was strategic recognition of capabilities that could transform his business in ways that went far beyond emergency problem-solving. "You're right that we haven't known each other long," Leonard acknowledged. "But I've spent 15 years building this company, and I've never seen anyone accomplish what you've achieved in 3 weeks. Not just the technical expertise, but the way you've changed how our team approaches problems and works together." Walter was quiet for a long moment, his attention shifting between Leonard's face and the workshop where his influence had become visible in small but significant ways. Diagnostic procedures had become more thorough and collaborative. Younger mechanics approached problems with increased confidence. The overall atmosphere reflected less stress and more professional satisfaction. "What kind of partnership are you thinking about?" Walter asked finally, his tone suggesting serious consideration rather than polite deflection. Leonard realized he hadn't thought through the specific structure of what he was proposing, only the general recognition that Walter's contributions deserved more than employee compensation. "Equal partnership," he said, making the decision as he spoke. 50-50 ownership, shared authority over all major business decisions, and formal recognition that this company's success depends on combining my business development capabilities with your technical and leadership expertise. The offer surprised Leonard himself with its completeness, but it felt correct as soon as he articulated it. Walter had demonstrated not just diagnostic skills, but the kind of collaborative leadership that Leonard's business model needed to evolve beyond its current limitations. Walter looked around the workshop with new attention, as if seeing the facility from the perspective of potential ownership rather than recent employment. "Leonard, I'm 72 years old. I don't know how many productive years I have left, and partnership commitments should extend beyond any individual's working life. Then we'll build something that outlasts both of us," Leonard replied, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "A company that combines technical excellence with collaborative leadership, that values experience alongside innovation, and that proves American business can compete internationally by recognizing excellence wherever it exists." Walter smiled then, the expression carrying warmth mixed with something that looked like hope. "You know, I've spent 8 months thinking my professional life was finished. Companies see age as liability, not asset. But you're suggesting something I hadn't even considered possible." Leonard felt a moment of clarity about what he was truly offering. Partnership with Walter wasn't just business expansion. It was personal transformation. The man who had built success through control and authority was choosing to share that success with someone whose approach challenged everything Leonard thought he knew about effective leadership. "Walter Hayes," Leonard said formally, extending his hand. "Would you like to become my business partner?" Walter studied Leonard's outstretched hand for a moment that felt like evaluation of more than business opportunity. Then he smiled with genuine warmth and gripped Leonard's hand with the firm confidence of someone accepting a future he had thought was beyond reach. "Leonard Farias," Walter replied. "I'd be honored to help you build something neither of us could accomplish alone."